Wonderful. So, scrupulosity is often described as fearing sin where there is none. Its Latin root, scrupulosus, means a small, sharp stone. So imagine that you have a small stone stuck in your shoe, and every step, every movement that you take causes discomfort. Every movement reminds you of the stone that's in your shoe. In the same way, scrupulosity constantly irritates the conscience, preventing spiritual peace and causes anxiety, doubt, and fear. This condition is a subtype of obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. It's not merely uh, being a devout or pious Catholic or seeking holiness. This is a psychological disorder that manifests through religious concerns. So individuals that experience scrupulosity, uh, they experience intrusive doubts about sin, compulsive rituals, and an inability to trust in God's mercy. Common themes would include fears around blasphemy, repeated checking of confessional behavior, obsession with ritual correctness, and anxiety over the purity of intentions. And these concerns are uh, so consuming that they interfere with your daily life, relationships, and spiritual life as well. So it's critical to recognize that scrupulosity blurs the spiritual growth and psychological burden. While a desire to live virtuously is natural, scrupulosity turns genuine piety into this cycle of fear. And we'll take a look at that later. So without proper pastoral guidance or psychological support, the scrupulous individual risks spiritual despair and distortion of their relationship with God. So this condition raises a very important question to us. How can the church minister to those struggling without inadvertently feeding into their anxiety? So this is being talked about today because it's very underaddressed, but it's very prevalent. So let's take a look at how many Catholics are actually affected by scrupulosity. So OCD affects 1.2% of uh, all US adults. Yet research shows that Catholics report the highest levels of scrupulous symptoms compared to other Christian denominations. So when we combine this epidemiological data with US religious demographics, roughly 732,000 American Catholics are likely affected by scrupulosity. So this reveals that scrupulosity is not some rare isolated issue, but it's something that is a widespread concern, and not just within our country. That's what I'll focus on here, but also within the world. So this requires immediate attention. Scrupulosity is frequently under-recognized. Many clergy and mental health professionals might encounter it without completely understanding it, often because it hides behind like deep devotion, or might come off as being piety or just being a perfectionist. But a student who repeatedly confesses their trivial thoughts, or an adult that prays excessively for reassurance, they might just they might just appear to be regular things. But they might exhibit symptoms of scrupulosity, but often that's misunderstood. It's just taken to be excessive piety. So understanding prevalence is important because it frames this pastoral challenge. This is not just a niche problem, but it's something that affects thousands of Catholics who might just be struggling in silence. So the awareness of scope allows the church to implement targeted strategies such as training for clergy, mental health, referral networks, and educational workshops that help believers with scrupulosity navigate their problems without shame. On to the next slide. So let's talk about the key features of scrupulosity. Scrupulosity manifests in three interrelated ways: obsessions, compulsions, and negative outcomes. Obsessions will include intrusive thoughts, often about mortal sin, blasphemy, or improperly performed confessions. So these thoughts are unwanted, persistent, and distressing. So this causes the intense anxiety that individuals just can't ignore. Compulsions are the ways that scrupulous people deal with these. Individuals might repeatedly confess their sins that were never even committed, engage in ritualistic ways and prayers, or continuously check the purity of their intentions. So while these behaviors might seem like devotion, they actually serve to temporarily relieve anxiety rather than a real mortal problem. The relief is fleeting, which just perpetuates the cycle. The consequences extend beyond these behaviors. So high levels of anxiety, depression, social withdrawal, and spiritual despair are common. The scrupulous believer's relationship with God might become characterized rather by fear rather than love, as mercy experienced as anxiety rather than comfort. And these patterns, they emphasize this need for pastoral and psychological responses that restore both faith and mental health. Go on to the OCD cycle. So scrupulosity, as mentioned before, operates in this vicious feedback loop. Uh, intrusive thoughts spark anxiety, leading to compulsive behaviors such as repeated confession or prayer rituals. And these actions may temporarily reduce anxiety, creating this illusion of control, but the obsessions inevitably return, often more intense than before. So we can look at this graph right here. So it starts off with this external trigger or spontaneous intrusive thought. What the person does next is that they interpret this as a something significant or meaningful. So they have this anxiety, they're trying to make sense of it. This leads to them uh, having a fear of sin, a fear of God, or obsessional preoccupation or doubt, leading to anxiety and distress. And then they need to calm this anxiety through this compulsion ritual. Like I said before, something like confession, something like a prayer ritual, it might not make sense to us, but it makes perfect sense to them. And then leading, there's a temporary relief of anxiety, which leads to them just doing the same thing over again as the anxiety comes up again. So recognizing this loop, it's absolutely essential for both clergy and clinicians, because in understanding the mechanism behind this, pastoral ministers can avoid unintentionally reinforcing their behaviors. They can provide strategies that foster God's trust and mercy and encourage healthy behaviors while representing the spiritual context of the disorder. So we'll go on to the next one. Scrupulosity, the average age at this onsets is about 19 years old. So at 19 years old, a lot of kids are going off to college. It's a very formative period of their identity and religious development. They start making personal choices about, do they want to go to mass on Sunday? Do they want to engage in personal prayer? It's something that every kid that age deals with. I'm looking at a kid that age right now. So high school and college students even are responsible for forming their own independent moral judgments while navigating new responsibilities, religious expectations, and peer influence. So religious practice during this period can become both a source of stability and a trigger for anxiety. So while a student might begin obsessively checking confessions or they might feel unworthiness in ways that compromise both their spiritual growth and psychological well-being. So early recognition and intervention are incredibly important. Parents, mentors, clergy who are attentive will be able to provide that guidance that they need uh, to stop any unhealthy patterns. So understanding this age of onset allows us to have proactive education, pastoral support, ensuring that there's formative experiences of faith that allow them to feel free with God, not to fear Him in a healthy sense. So from a psychological perspective, right? So we're integrating these perspectives here. The most effective treatments for scrupulosity or OCD in general are exposure and response prevention, commonly referred to as ERP, combined with cognitive behavioral therapy, which is known as CBT. Uh, so ERP helps individuals face their fears without engaging in compulsive behaviors, gradually teaching them to just tolerate uncertainty. And on the other hand, cognitive behavioral therapy works along with this in addressing cognitive distortions that underlie obsessive thoughts, which helps the person reshape their perception of sin and moral responsibility. Uh, Pharmacological treatment like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are known as SSRIs, might help in severe cases and can help reduce anxiety and allow the person to more fully engage in their behavioral interventions. So importantly, uh, treatment must respect the individual's religious identity. Therapy should support faith, not undermine it, and clergy need to collaborate with clinicians to ensure this. Uh, you want the person to have their belief preserved and strengthened, not to have clinicians working against it. So this integrated approach highlights the importance of combining clinical expertise with pastoral sensitivity. Scrupulosity cannot be treated effectively from only one perspective. Faith and mental health must be intertwined with scrupulosity, and both must be addressed. So as we say this, uh, Catholics, once again, are not the only people who experience scrupulosity. OCD is a universal disorder. It takes form in many different ways. This project focuses on the Catholic expression, but let me touch a little bit on different areas as well. So among Catholics, scrupulosity really centers especially around confession, the seriousness of mortal sin, and purity of thought. While in contrast, Jewish people might focus on their dietary laws or ritual observance, and Muslims might focus on prayer requirements. So this means that treatment and pastoral care cannot just be one size fits all. Understanding the religious context of OCD symptoms allows clinicians and clergy to just make the distinguish make the to distinguish between religious practice and pathological behavior. So by framing scrupulosity within a Catholic norm, a Catholic setting, we can appreciate exactly why it's so prevalent within our tradition. Confession and sacramental life are intended to nurture spiritual growth, but when anxiety and compulsions take over, they become a method of fear instead of a vehicle for grace. Uh, so awareness of this helps clergy to provide guidance that restores the sacraments to their original intended purpose. In Catholic theology, conscience is described as man's most secret core and sanctuary. It's a sacred place where man encounters God's written law on the heart. A healthy conscience guides a person towards freedom, moral responsibility, and the love of God and neighbor. A scrupulous conscience, on the other hand, magnifies minor failings, distorts moral perceptions, and doubts the reality of divine mercy, which is so, so important. For the scrupulous believer, venial sins feel like major moral transgressions, and God might be experienced as a strict judge rather than a loving father. This distortion can erode at somebody's faith, joy, trust in God, and it might turn prayer into sacraments for occasions of fear rather than occasions of grace. So, recognizing the theological dimension is absolutely important. Pastoral care must address the conscience in its deepest sense, guiding the believer towards a true understanding of God's mercy, uh, being free from anxiety, and reinforcing a relationship that is based on love and mercy instead of fear. So it is also incredibly important to note that while somebody might experience scrupulosity, that does not mean that they do not have the chance for holiness. In fact, many of our saints struggled with scrupulosity, although it might have not been called that then. But they use this condition to better cultivate a deeper understanding of God's mercy. So Saint Alphonsus Liguori, the guy all the way on the right, uh, he personally experienced scrupulosity, and he developed a pastoral approach in his ministry that was marked by compassion, patience, and clarity. Uh, his own anxieties taught him how to guide uh, his penitents with gentleness and ensured that people who were faithful could experience forgiveness without being trapped in a cycle of obsessive doubt. Saint Therese of Lisieux, or Saint Therese of the Little Flower, many of us are familiar with her. She struggled from uh, youthful scrupulosity, and she described it as being a terrible disease in her writings. And she said that this filled her thoughts and her actions with absolute anguish. Yet her little way of trust and surrender to God's love, with that, she was able to overcome her scruples and demonstrated that deep anxiety about sin can be transformed into a life of holiness. And you see this through her little way. Uh, Her experience shows that the path of scrupulosity isn't about perfection, but it's learning how to trust in God's mercy. St. Ignatius of Loyola on the left, he was the founder of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuit order, and he struggled with compulsive confessions in his early life. So through discernment, through proper spiritual guidance, he learned to differentiate true scruples from false ones, ultimately finding that freedom in trusting God's mercy rather than obsessing and reviewing his past sins. So, together, these examples show that scrupulosity, when met with prayer and understanding and guidance, can coexist with this path to holiness, this path to sanctity. It offers insight for both clergy, like you have your examples of uh, Saint Ignatius and Saint Alphonsus, um, and also lay believers on how to respond to this condition with a sense of compassion. So the sacraments, especially the sacrament of the Eucharist and confession, they are meant to be encounters with God's grace. But for those with scrupulosity, this encounter can be filled with anxiety rather than healing. So in confession, the scrupulous individual might confess sins that were actually never committed, that were driven by compulsion rather than true confession and contrition. Um, Instead of relief, the sacrament becomes just something of mere repetition, and it becomes a cycle of doubt and guilt and reinforces obsessive behaviors. Similarly, the Eucharist which is intended for nourishment and union with Christ, can trigger anxiety for the scrupulous believer. Fear of unworthiness or obsession over proper preparation can prevent full participation within the sacrament. Some might avoid communion unnecessarily or engage in rituals just to feel right, to take away that anxiety before approaching the altar. So, this distortion of the sacrament highlights the pastoral guidance. Clergy must help believers understand that God's mercy is not contingent upon perfection, but it is something that is freely given. The Eucharist is healing for the weak, not a reward for the flawless. And confession should not lead to despair, it should lead to trust. So, by restoring the sacraments to their intended purpose, clergy help the faithful experience grace rather than fear. Um, I thought that was a very interesting image I found online. I searched confession images. There's not many images of confession, but there's one. It's also a very interesting one. So, effective confessional guidance requires both theological insight and psychological awareness. Clergy needs to set boundaries that prevent repetitive ritualistic confessions, which can reinforce these compulsive behaviors. Simply offering reassurance can unintentionally feed the OCD cycle, which increases anxiety rather than alleviate it. Confessors should absolutely encourage trust in the sufficiency of absolution. So when you leave confession, you are absolved from your sins. So they need to emphasize that and emphasize that God's forgiveness is complete and it doesn't require complete perfection or validation. So confessors must also use language that is patient with the scrupulous confessor, merciful and invitational, helping them to recognize the mercy of God as a source of freedom instead of fear. But at the same time, priests and ministers, they must remain alert to signs that an individual's scrupulosity might also require this clinical intervention. So when it's appropriate, clergy can collaborate with Catholic sensitive clinicians. There's a whole database out there of Catholic psychologists and psychiatrists, and this helps to ensure that psychological treatment complements spiritual care. This integrated approach protects the sanctity of the sacrament while supporting holistic well-being. So scrupulosity can also, like we were saying earlier, it can lead to obsessive focus on intentions and ritualistic performance in the context of the Eucharist. I love this image right here. Pope Francis said in one of his encyclicals, "The Eucharist is not a prize for the perfect, but a powerful medicine and nourishment for the weak." So a scrupulous believer might fear that a slight distraction invalidates the reception or that improper preparation displeases God. These fears transform the sacrament into a source of grace, like Pope Francis was saying, into a sacrament of anxiety. So some individuals might avoid communion altogether, and they believe that their sinfulness disqualifies them from participating. Others engage in rituals or over prepare themselves, seeking a source of perfectionism, which is absolutely unattainable and unnecessary as well. These behaviors reflect the broader OCD cycle that anxiety triggers compulsions, and this will provide some temporary relief, but it can only reinforce fear in the long term. So pastoral care needs to emphasize that the Eucharist is a gift that's meant to nourish the soul, not a test of your moral perfection. So ministers can guide the faithful to approach the altar with trust and help them to seek the sacrament as a source of healing, union, and love instead of uh, fear and judgment. So I have this little chart here. So let's talk about the tender versus scrupulous conscience and how we can approach this. So understanding the difference between a tender conscience and a scrupulous one is absolutely critical. A tender conscience is one that is sensitive to sin, desires holiness, and guides moral decisions with freedom and responsibility. Scrupulosity takes this and distorts it into fear and magnifying doubt in minor faults. So pastoral ministers must start from a place of mercy and patience and recognize that some struggles reflect a psychological disorder instead of a moral failure. Being harsh or rigid only deepens this anxiety and perpetuates compulsive behavior. So clergy must reinforce the penitent's genuine desire for holiness. We have to remember that the scrupulous person has a genuine desire for holiness, but they must also gently redirect this obsessive tendency and behavior. So encouraging therapy without stigma is absolutely essential. Clergy needs to collaborate with Catholic sensitive clinicians and integrate clinical insights with pastoral care. The goal is to support the entire person, mind and soul, ensuring that faith is strengthened rather than undermined with scrupulosity. Using language that is, excuse me, sorry. Let me figure it out. There we go. So many priests feel underprepared to address scrupulosity. Uh, Research indicates that clergy often lack both psychological understanding and pastoral strategies specific to obsessive compulsive religious manifestations. This structural gap leaves believers feeling vulnerable as confessional guidance might not address the underlying disorder. So, to respond effectively, the church must invest in diocesan formation and workshops for their clergy, seminarians, and all ministers within the church. So, training should include recognizing OCD symptoms, distinguishing a healthy versus a scrupulous conscience, and also just helping the believer to grow to trust God, to desire holiness, and also to collaborate with Catholic focused clinicians. Additionally, referral networks connecting clergy to Catholic sensitive mental health professionals. Again, that's crucial. Long-term accompaniment by both pastoral and clinical support helps the scrupulous believer to develop trust in God's mercy and freedom in faith, while ensuring that mental health needs are met in a compassionate, holistic manner. And there's the image of the shepherd guiding the sheep just to show, that a good shepherd will in fact guide his sheep. So we must have good shepherds within the church. I think I skipped a slide. I apologize. I think this is my last slide. But here's a overview of what I just went over. I apologize there. So scrupulosity, once again, it sits at the integration of clinical OCD, conscious formation, sacramental life, and grace. So pastoral care must navigate these dimensions simultaneously, ensuring that interventions are psychologically sound and theologically faithful. Integrating clinical insights with spiritual guidance allows the clergy to break cycles of fear while nurturing authentic devotion. The takeaways from this are absolutely clear that scrupulosity is OCD that is expressed in a religious setting, distorting perceptions of God's mercy and fueling fear and despair. The church must respond with compassion and provide training and resources for clergy and promote collaborations with clinicians who respect Catholic identity. So the ultimate goal is to uh, guide believers from fear to freedom, doubt to trust, and anxiety to confidence in God's love. So there's some key takeaways. Um, and scrupulosity is not it does not have to be a lifelong burden. With integrated care, the faithful can rediscover the joy, the peace, and the grace intended within their spiritual life, fully preparing them for the sacraments without stepping into fear. So there's my presentation for today. Thank you. Yeah, so I hope this presentation gave you insight into why we must integrate these approaches. So at this time, I'll take any questions that you guys might have, and then go ahead. Yes, Dr.